Gotta put the mic on. Fastest announcements ever. Okay. Some of you were here last year when I did my talk. I'm Mark Sprang. I'm the archivist at Jerome Library at Bowling Green State University in your friendly neighbor state of Ohio. Well, not so friendly for Michigan natives like me, I guess, but there's that long time rivalry for no reason. But my particular job is I work with Great Lakes Maritime History Collections, and specifically for your needs, all the different collections of naval architectural records for shipyards on the Great Lakes. Our oldest one, I know off the top of my head, our oldest one, I didn't bring because it's too fragile. The oldest one is 1867 and the newest one is 1981. I did bring an 1878 over there though. That's in good shape. But, so why, if anybody knows where Bowling Green, Ohio is, it's about 20 minutes south of Toledo and it's landlocked. And we have a maritime collection. So I'll let that sink in for a minute. I think our only body of water is a pond that they had to dig for a golf course because it's so flat. Yeah, if you've had to drive through Northwest Ohio, it's the worst. It's so flat. So a history professor named Dr. Richard Wright, this is about 1968, back when you could hop into a tenure track job in your early 30s. He was a Great Lakes nut from a very young age. I mean, there's even letters from him as a teenager, like writing to these title offices. Can you help me find where this 1850 shipyard in Cleveland was? So yeah, very into it from a young age. He served 5 years on Great Lakes vessels as a summer job. And then he amassed his own personal collection. And so it sort of started from there because there really wasn't a public institution that had a collection just related to the history of this region. There's great ones for each state, like the Bentley has just amazing Michigan history collections, Wisconsin Historical Society, places like that. But they have one that's just concentrating on the maritime aspects. So, like I said, we have a ton of naval architectural records. So a tube like this, I think we have at least 2,300 of them. Yeah, it's a lot. Luckily, I didn't have to barcode all of them. That's what my student is for. So thankfully, most of them are stored offsite just because we don't have space in the building. Kind of like M Library here has the beer building where they have a ton of just extra books and things that just don't fit in the library. It's just too much. But also several thousand books, manuscript collections, diaries, narratives, massive photograph collection, as you would imagine. A lot of them are construction photographs from places like American Shipbuilding Company. So you get keeling to launch and fit out the whole process, which is really interesting. Well, for the people in this room, it probably would be. Most people would be like, it's metal stuff. So that's what I got from, I get a lot of couples that come in, older couples. So you have an older guy who's super into boats and the wife's like, I'm just here because I was riding with them. So I'm like, I always try to find something they can be interested in as well. The first one I'll mention is Posh Marine Services. So they were based in Erie, Pennsylvania and concentrated mostly on under 100-foot vessels, mainly steel and aluminum. They did a lot of pioneering work with aluminum in the 40s and 50s. After seeing the success of aluminum aircraft structures during the war. So you had this surplus of engineering material and knowledge to be able to make these go forward. And most of their operations were like 1920s to 1950s. It's not a very big collection, but they have everything from like patrol craft, tugboats, police boats, fire boats, lakes and ocean survey ships, things like that, rescue ships. Actually helped out the Maryland Department of Natural Resources last year because they have one they ordered from there in the 60s. And we had a couple of the original plans because they had nothing. They didn't have any paperwork. They didn't have anything. So I almost said your tax dollars at work, but that's not Michigan, it's Maryland. But I'm sure there's similar things in this state too. And they even built some of the old ferries for the Arnold line for Mackinac Island. Obviously, those aren't in service anymore because they're very inefficient because they were built in the 50s. So it was all about brute force versus aerodynamics. Or not aerodynamics, but yeah. So I'm in the humanities. Science is now my area of expertise. So that's what I say. If I wanted absolutes, I would have gone into STEM. So, I mean, humanities, I don't do absolutes. So there's a good example of like the sprinkler system for the boat for safety. That one, and this one, it's onion skin paper, which means it's really, really thin. For anyone old enough to know what a carbon copy even is. So if you had a form with multiple thin pages underneath it and you had to write hard and it ran through to the pages underneath so you could send multiple copies to people before copy machines existed. That's what CC and email is for, which is super idiosyncratic, kind of like having a floppy disk as your save icon still. Like no one's used that in 25 years, but most people seem to know what it is. Here's another similar one. Mainly it's the ventilation, water systems, that sort of thing. Some of them are original, some are copies. This one's definitely a copy. Although the machines they had to use to make these were very messy. And if it was even slightly crooked, the whole thing would be destroyed. So I've heard from enough older people who had to make these, what a pain they were. And these are the small ones. The biggest one we have is 12 feet long. Yeah, there's a nice profile view. I like that one. 65. Another interesting one is R.A. Stearn. So after World War II, you had a surplus of knowledge and also a surplus of extra tonnage that was built for the war. So you had this interesting combination of trying to repurpose all these war vessels for civilian use. So for example, there was a tank landing craft that was converted to a car, like an auto ferry to carry you across Lake Michigan. Turning excess tankers into lake service with some minor modifications. You can usually tell if a vessel's been converted to lake service because of the really sharp prow that you don't get on most lake freighters because of the difference in conditions that they have to deal with. So yeah, most of his work was involved with that. And he was an attaché for the Royal Navy during World War II as well, kind of talking to them about what lake shipbuilding was like. They couldn't build many big vessels here because the St. Lawrence Seaway wasn't built yet. So anything, it had to be whole, it had to be under 260 feet. Anything bigger than that went to Buffalo, it got cut in half, towed to Montreal and stuck back together and then towed overseas. So until the 50s, there's a huge limitation there. And so most of the shipyards on the lakes were doing mostly service for this region, occasionally boats for other places. And then once the Seaway opened, well, that's a whole other can of worms about the Seaway not being totally as cool as everyone thought it was going to be because it was already too small. I forget what Seaway Max is, but I'm sure a lot of you know already. I know it's 700 something odd feet. So Stearn was based in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, where Fincantieri is. So one of the only active shipyards left on the Great Lakes out of all the ones that used to exist. I have a folder here in the front from a guy named Loudon Wilson. So he wasn't a naval engineer or a naval architect, but he was a commercial artist, and he grew up in Scotland when he was a small child, and his mom took him to the hills overlooking the River Clyde to watch all the shipbuilding, which I can't imagine what that looked like in the 1900s, 19 teens. It was just absolutely amazing. So yeah, he was a commercial artist in Detroit, sort of Mad Men style in like the 20s through the 50s, doing a lot of work for like auto companies, architectural firms, stuff like that. And so, but he did all this artwork on Great Lakes vessels in his spare time, which I don't know how he had because he was always busy. And since he started doing this in the 20s, he had the opportunity to talk to a lot of old timers from the lakes who were still on like schooners and sailing vessels and wooden ships. So he has an interesting bridge. So in the beginning of his notes, he actually credits, here's all the retired captains I talked to. And some of them will even say, he wrote this down on the side. He's like, oh, I talked to Captain so-and-so. And he said, actually, it was like this. So this museum has it wrong. So he likes to prove museums wrong in his writings, which I think is great. And most of his drawings are smaller than 8 by 10 inches. So when you see the level of detail, you have to imagine it's like smaller than a sheet of notebook paper. So like that one is ink and charcoal. That's 3 by 3 inches, and it became a stamp. So that's all Lummoth lines and ink, which, yeah, the schooner Enterprise, which was a Royal Navy vessel in the 18th century on the lakes. One of my favorite ones. Yeah, and the varying levels of detail. That one's almost kind of animated looking to me, at least. It needs but it needs color. Most of them are black and white, but ones like that. So he actually did that's like pencil for the sky. And then he used like sponges and erasers to kind of smear it to give it that foggy look, and to get the effect of the smoke sort of dissipating into the air. Because if you see any old pictures of a harbor full of steamboats, they don't always show you the huge black cloud above everything. That's why all the period advertisements for tourism are like, go out to the lakes on a boat, because it's literally cleaner and better for you to do that, which was very true. Everything was coal until the 50s when they started converting vessels to diesel. Someone here probably knows there's one coal-fired vessel left on the lakes that still operates. And it's the Badger, which you can take from Ludington to Manitowoc across the lakes, built in the 50s. But they have all the special equipment added in, because it used to be, you just, once your bin of coal ash was full, you just dumped it in the lakes. Same with sewage, actually. And that lasted until at least the 50s, 60s. So you dumped all your garbage and sewage overboard. So we have, interviews with people who served on boats in the 60s, and they're like, oh yeah, if we broke a plate in the galley, we just tossed it overboard. It's like all the toilets and showers just flush directly into the lake. So that's why Lake Erie is sometimes called the lake that survived, because of the level of pollution. And that's an area I've been picking up more in, is sort of the environmental history, because there's this amazing industrial history of the Rust Belt, but then there's that whole, so the environmental legacy that's left behind after all of that. I mean, yeah, the Cuyahoga River did indeed catch fire in Cleveland, but it did 5 times before that. So that tells you how bad it was. And that's a steamboat that sunk, and it was before photography, so there's no photographs of it. So the best we can do is sketches, notes, descriptions from newspapers where they'll say, it was this long, it was this wide, it was this many tons berth end, and you had to kind of guesstimate from that. So it's been really helpful. I do get a decent number of people who are either writing books about shipwrecks or are shipwreck hunters, because there's still hundreds of them undiscovered in the lake system. So if we have any sketches or architectural records, it's super helpful, because they can see exactly what they're looking at. Some of them dive, most of them are older, so they do ROVs instead. I could do a whole presentation just on that. It's a lot of fun, because I've actually got to do it, which was super cool. Because the one guy, he just has a PS4 controller hooked up, and he just Bluetooths his ROV through his phone. So he's just like sitting in the boat, the boat has autopilot, so he just has it running a pattern, and he's just like, yeah, he's like, it's expensive and I have no money, but it's awesome. Yeah, this is a great example of his, like, even his handwriting is just amazing. That's all hand drawn. So he did a whole book or a whole volume just on hull and deck designs of Great Lakes vessels, another one on sails and riggings, another one just on terminology, which I consult the Naval. It's been 5 years since I started this job, and I still consult naval dictionaries quite frequently. Because especially if he's quoting sailors from the 19th century, they're going to use a lot of shorthand. Yeah, and you can actually see right there, he's pointing at the back sail, and he's like, Captain John Thurston later doubted the logic of, the sails being that way. Okay, fair enough. So he was not that interested in steamboats. It was the schooners, because at the peak in the probably late 1870s, there were about 1,200 sail vessels on the lakes of varying sizes and several hundred steamboats, because there were railroads, yes, but that was the way to travel. They were the semi trucks of the day. So a lot of the schooners were family owned. So that was your family business, especially because you could drag along your wife / daughter / sister to be the cook for no cost. That was quite frequent. I did a separate presentation just on women on the Great Lakes in that time period, and it's what you would expect it to be. So yeah, because most of the time, the only jobs you could get were cook, or you were the head steward. So basically like the head waitress / room service type on a passenger boat. And it was your responsibility to keep all of the kids and women calm during storms. But the most common thing I'll add to that is that any of the newspaper accounts that mention that like a female crew member was wounded is that she was the one who complained the least about it. There's one from the 30s where a boat ran up on a reef, and it's like she got a compound fracture of her arm, and she was the one helping everyone else. Like, I love it. The amount of grit you had to have to do that is just, I know I couldn't do it. I'm like, I got out of bed this morning and that's about it. Yeah, and then he gets into super duper detail about how it varied depending on shipyard. Because in the 1840s, 1850s, everyone is building stuff based on ocean going designs. before they realized, well, barkentines and brigantines really aren't going to work as well. We need the schooners here for the shallower waters for the more maneuverability. And how, oh, there's brackets behind the windows, and all schooners had them, regardless of size. You know, typical bows and sterns. I like that one a lot. But he doesn't always include scale, so I'm glad he did this time. But the amount of technical work he was able to do with just like his hands is amazing. I've never seen any of his commercial art. It'll be really interesting to see what he did for money versus what he actually liked to do. So I think all of us can relate to that to some degree. Or like this schooner. So when the boats outlived their usefulness, they weren't even worth the insurance money anymore because they were just rotting wood at some point. So you would just leave them. A lot of ports had boneyards. This is just a spot where you can just stick boats and let them rot. So in the 1930s, a lot of them were still around. So he was like this one, he says, I sketched at Toronto in 1934. Like he went over there from Detroit because it was even easier to do that back then. Went over from Detroit and drew what he saw. Some of them still exist. A lot of them have been dredged out, or in the 19th and early 20th century, if a wreck was considered in the way, the Corps of Engineers or a salvager could just dynamite it. So they literally, yeah, they would just drop it in there and just blow it up. But I think one of my favorites is drawing the sterns, because we don't have color photographs of the old sailing ships. So you only can guess at what the livery was, because most of them were independent. So everyone had their own colors. Yeah, and sometimes he puts question marks. I'm like, I'm not sure if this is right. Or these are lumber vessels and how they change, because you can see there's less mass on the earlier one, which is really interesting that the later one would have more, because once sailing wasn't economical anymore, they would just cut down the masts and use them as barges. Because most of if anybody's from northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, any of that area, pretty much any town there was a lumber town. And that's why the only reason it existed was to just cut down the entire forest. Well, to make masts for these trees, which is, as a side note, some of the shipwreck hunters and explorers they like to look at the dendrology of the wood, because it's old growth forest, because there's a state park here in the Lower Peninsula. I don't remember where, but it's like the only stand of old growth forest left in the entire Lower Peninsula. So, because some of them are 400 or 500 years old, because you needed a really wide, thick, completely straight tree to make a mast. And then they had these giant milling machines to round them out and everything, because some of the masts were, 100, 120 feet high. So the boat would sink, but you get a newspaper report the next spring saying, oh, the top of the mast is still sticking out of the water, which just creeps me out. Like, I don't know why it does, but it does. Knowing that if I didn't know it was there, I'd be fine. But seeing there's part of it going, hey, and that's one of our favorite ones. Someone used this for like the beginning paper of a book about building a schooner. So having all the different ends and the details, like the Canadian one, not surprisingly, has a beaver on it. Yeah, there's a beaver, there's like elk. Some of them were super plain, and some people went to town and like making it really artistic. It just depended on the shipbuilder. And a lot of this, plans for almost all these vessels don't survive, because it was usually just a local carpenter who would do it. He would just have a spot along the river. He'd get a bunch of guys in the off season. They build a boat, slide it in, and go on. Most of it was up here. They could do a lot of it in their heads, which is just amazing, or sketch down. This is by far the biggest collection we have, the American Shipbuilding Company, and then all of its predecessors. So at the height, they had shipyards in Superior, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Bay City, Michigan, Detroit, Toledo, Lorain, Ohio, Buffalo, and Chicago. So from both the demand for new ships, because they were growing so quickly. I mean, the average steamer in the 1880s was like 200 feet long, and by 1906, you already had 600-foot steamers. And then the repair work, because accidents were very, very frequent. They did have charts, but there was always something that wasn't there that they would end up running into. And that's Superior City, which was the first steel-hauled vessel built in Lorain, Ohio, which is where they headquartered. The company was headquartered in Cleveland, but their big shipyard was there. There's they had 2,000-foot plus dry docks by the end in the early 80s when they closed, which if you go to Google Maps now is marinas with luxury apartments in the middle, while the rest of the city is dead. It's a common theme. A lot of these former dry docks are now marinas or pleasure boats and sailboats and things. At least they're still being used for a semi-similar purpose. So this collection came to us in the late 80s from the company. They closed all their Great Lakes operations in the early 80s because of union issues. Well, the company was owned by the Steinbrenners, who owned the New York Yankees as well. And they were famously nice to labor, we'll put it that way, as in very combative. I've actually met a few people who were at that yard in Toledo when it closed. They said, we got there, they were company lawyers, and they said, the company's closing, everything in the lakes, we'll wait here till you all leave. That's all they got. They got no severance, no nothing. And then they moved to Tampa and then were bankrupt in less than 10 years. So I guess justice came. They also promised us a ton of money to work on this collection, which never came either. So I don't have a soft spot in my heart for the company, just for what they made. So one of the interesting types they made were car ferries. Most of the time that's referring to train cars, especially across Lake Michigan. It was much more economical to slide the train cars onto a boat and take them across in 4 to 5 hours than to go all the way around and have to go through Chicago, which is still kind of true. I took the Badger once just because on principle to avoid Chicago. It still applies. Yeah, that's the Pierre Marquette #2. That particular company, the Pierre Marquette Railroad, was centered in Flint and Saginaw, and then also the Ann Arbor Railroad. So headquartered here, yeah, and it went all the way up to Frankfurt and then across to one place in Michigan in the Upper Peninsula and one in Wisconsin, and they ran for about 70 years, bringing iron ore and coal cars across, and a couple across Lake Erie as well. One of which is sort of the holy grail of, actually it's that one, Marquette and Bessemer #2. That sank in 1909 and hasn't been found, which Lake Erie is really shallow, so it's quite surprising. So there's lots of interest in that one. That's one of the holy grail lake wrecks. Yeah, there it is again. That's ice, by the way. So I ask this question every year. It's really fun and easy. So look at the butt end of that boat and you tell me what major design flaw there is. Anyone can. You can just yell it out. I don't care.
Not a lot of clearance between the water and inside the boat.
Ding. And there's no gate on the back. So literally there were sets of railroad tracks and a locomotive would back the cars in and lock them into place. But in rough weather, they would also do this. So a couple other ones that were almost sinking were frantically trying to push rail cars of coal into Lake Michigan. Yeah, because that's a person for 3 people for size reference right there, because it was over 300 feet long. Yeah, and then 1910 was another one that went down where they were trying to do the same thing. They're like pushing it, and that was just discovered in 2021, Pierre Marquette 18. But same thing, no stern gate. So they were always trying to go against the waves. But there's a couple of portholes and vents right above the water line, and that's where the crew quarters were. And so there's speculation like, oh, someone must have left one of those open. So the water just kept adding up. And then eventually they're just like, we can't hold it anymore. But surprising that we haven't found that one. The Pierre Marquette 18, all the trail cars went to the back. So you can actually see, you can probably easily find articles and videos on the wreck, because I have the video too if anyone wants it. It's like, let's hit stern first, and it's still sticking up at a 30-degree angle 122 years later, 123 years later. It's pretty amazing. It's also super spooky because one of the videos they took is like, it's just murky and all of a sudden you see like the bow coming at you and you're like, this doesn't feel right because it's underwater. Clearly not a submarine. Well, what do they say? Every boat can be a submarine once. So yeah, and this had a pretty good career. And then the worst thing was for both of those boats, they built a brand new one the following year with the exact same name again, which no, that's just bad karma. You don't do that. Because there were also there were some passenger cabins on top too. And so there's a pilot house on the front and the back. Even though there's only propellers in the back, you need someone there. And then they had a telephone line so they could call the front and be like, slow down. We're going to hit the dock. Yeah, huge. I don't know why. Finally, but none of them were lost after this, thankfully. But that's still, I know a number of people who are doing very, very detailed work trying to find out where this boat is, because the biggest expense is finding it, because you have to have a boat, you have to have the gas, you have to have the time and the knowledge to read side scan sonar, to have cameras, to have all that stuff. So make friends with someone who has that. Never do it yourself. That's from the guys who actually do it. That's the advice they said. It's like, make friends with someone with a pool. Don't get your own. Yeah, there's another picture of it. That's a chunk of ice exploding as it goes by, because the ice actually used to be a serious problem on the lakes, but with climate change, it really isn't, except in the Straits of Mackinac and Lake Superior areas, and Buffalo when they get 5 feet of snow in one weekend, apparently, which they just did last month. Because it used to be a real issue with the wooden hulls. The ice was forming so quickly and moving so quickly, it would just crush them, the hulls, and sink them. But on the bright side, they were usually close enough to shore, they could just hop off and walk over. But not always. And then they'd send someone back in the spring to be like, can you see anything left of our boat? Because usually if it ran up in a random beach somewhere, the locals would just strip it for parts. They'd burn the wood, they'd take all the tackle, the rope, the dishes, like anything they could find, the cargo, which was usually really boring. There's no like Spanish doubloons on the Great Lakes. There's no treasure ships here. It's wood, coal, iron, like a few of them have like general merchandise. Like there's one with shoes and lifesavers. And in the right conditions, like especially in Lake Superior where it's very anoxic, there's almost no growth. So it looks like it just happened a few years ago. Like that's yet another presentation I could talk about forever. So a type of boat that was unique to American Shipbuilding Company they built in Superior were whaleback boats. There's still one in Superior you can see called the Meteor that was retired in the 60s, 70s. But basically that main hull is all black and it's cylindrical. And the idea was that it was supposedly more stable than regular boats would be. But some of them lasted longer than you might expect. But most of them were retired by the Great Depression because the hatches were so small and they just couldn't compete with modern haulers anymore. But about 30 or 40 were built and a lot of them went to the coast. But there's at least 3 sunk in the Great Lakes. And then the Alexander McDougall, the guy who invented them, is like, I'm going to go to Seattle area to build one there. And then he built one and went out of business. So that didn't work, obviously. But they called them whalebacks because they had such low freeboard and with all black. And sometimes they even painted the structures darker. So it looked like an ominous shape. If anyone's seen like silly April Fool's social media posts about, oh, I went whale watching on Lake Huron. So they probably saw one of those. Yeah. So there's a good, that's 1895. That's the layout of the boat. If you can see how small the hatches are in the middle though, that's not even half the width. So the modern unloading equipment couldn't fit in there. So, well, in the 1860s, before they had anything like that, you had to do it all by hand. So you'd have maybe horses driving a crane, and you had guys with wheelbarrows and shovels had to go in and unload like 600 tons of coal by themselves. So yeah, that's one of my favorites. Just because they're so weird compared to anything else. That's what I like about geographically different areas of shipbuilding, because even on the lakes, they would build vastly different ones. Like if they built them on Lake Ontario, they'd want them to be able to run the rapids in St. Lawrence River. Or Lake Erie, they had to be really shallow because Lake Erie is really shallow. Ones to go to Lake Superior have to be built more sturdily because of the conditions. Because even in that huge storm we had Christmas weekend, some areas in Lake Superior had, even like Eastern Lake Erie had 27-foot waves. So, and the lake was 100 inches deeper on the east side than the west side because it's so shallow, the wind can actually force the water to one end. So fun fact for everyone. But my favorites, and for a lot of people's favorites, were the huge palatial passenger ships that were built. Like this is the SSC&B, which is creatively named because it was the Cleveland and Buffalo navigation company. You could get from Cleveland to Buffalo in 8 hours, or Detroit to Cleveland in 8 hours, which in 1910 was pretty amazing if you weren't on it, because you didn't have to switch trains or anything. The glory days when every town was accessible by electric trains, imagine. Even where I live in Bowling Green was. So any small town you go through and it has an extra wide left turn lane in the middle, that was probably the streetcar lines. And a lot of them were connected. So you'd see this schedule for this boat and it would say, if you get to this city, the train to New York City leaves at this time. So you could hop aboard. And the C&B is my favorite just because we have the coolest photographs of it. Yeah, the 4 stacks in the middle, it's 6 decks. You've got all the cargo doors down there at the bottom. And in its final days, they could also fit cars in there too. But especially in the 19-teens, 1920s, because the infrastructure for long distance car trips like we can do now just didn't exist. So you just stuck your car on and it would drop you off wherever and you could go. That's one of my favorite pictures. So when it was brand new in Cleveland, they hired a professional photographer to go through and take all these beautiful shots to be like, look at how amazing our cruise ship is. Because most of it, this is originally for overnight trips. Yeah, you get on at dinner time in like Detroit, there'd be a captain's, you'd eat, get wasted. There's a captain's ball and you'd wake up and you'd be in Cleveland. So back when like places like Buffalo were hot vacation destinations. So yeah, I know, right? This is no disrespect to Buffalo. Any Buffalonians? Okay, good. I'm okay. Yeah. So that's 3 decks high. That's a watercolor painting on the ceiling that's meant to look like like a Renaissance painting, like you're looking up from the hold of a Renaissance sailing ship. This is really cool. And that's mostly oak and mahogany work in there. Tropical plants, as rich people do. It's Michigan. Why don't we put tropical plants on a boat? Yeah, let's do it. That's just the men's lounge. The men's and women's lounges had to be separate. There were separate smoking rooms for men and women because of how popular it was. If you go to Detroit on Belle Isle, there's the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, and their lobby has part of the smoking room woodwork from another one of these vessels. It's the only one that survives because someone was able to get it and they threw it in a barn so it didn't get destroyed. Because they had like that window at the top is stained glass, like handmade Tiffany glass, and like they rivaled the ocean liners of the time. They weren't as big, but ships like the Titanic get all the excitement, but that's probably because it sank and these didn't. So, and then we have a huge, like a 3x4. It was 8.5 by 11, but it folds out to 3x4 tour guide for the boat. So this is from probably the 30s. So they're advertising luxury cruises during the Depression, which is super audacious of them to do that. But yeah, 7-day cruise for $60 or $66. And it cost a little extra if you wanted your own bathroom. There were communal bathrooms like freshman dorms. And then once you get to be an upperclassman, you're like, I get a bathroom? Yeah. I did grad school here, so I didn't have to stay in a dorm. So I'm only assuming. Yeah, so you go to Buffalo and they tell you to go to Niagara Falls first, or you could pick it up in Cleveland. And then you went to like Mackinac Island, Chicago, places like that. Take you to Chicago to go shopping. And they have all these wonderfully staged pictures of everybody just smiling. It's like, these like shuffleboard on the deck is the best thing I've ever done in my entire life. And the fashion. That's usually the way to date stuff. You just look for like hairstyles or in cars and you can kind of tell what time period it is. So this is where, yeah, like cheek to middle neck length hair was the most popular for women. This is right after flapper era. So it's getting a little longer, but not as long as it would be in the 40s. Another total side note. Have you noticed I get sidelined very easily? Yeah, so they advertise the captain's ball and they would bring on like jazz bands and all kinds of things to keep you busy. I had to Google some of the food because I didn't know what it was, because there's dishes that have been out of fashion for like 80 years. And that would be like, ew, no. Why would I want that? Like there was cream of bologna once. I'm like, I've been a student, but I don't think I'd go that far. Like I'll eat the ramen dry out of the packet before I do that. Oh, yeah. And that gives you a map of like all of the rooms, pictures in the rooms. This boat was considered luxurious because every room had a phone in it, which is really unusual for that time. So you could call room service, you could call a steward, you could call like, they had a separate room just for writing because you could drop off postcards wherever you were. So much easier now. You just, hey, I'm here, boop, done. Now it's like, that was a whole process. You got to go get a pen and you got to pick out, it's a whole thing. They even have bookstores in some of these too. But having a phone, so you could call someone in another room, be like, hey, do you want to meet at the bar in 2 hours? All right, we'll do it. That's the way it was when I was an undergrad. Just kidding. That was just, cell phones were just, it was right after 9/11. So like cell phones were just starting up. So that was the easiest way. Every room had a landline in it. So you could call, you got a directory of like all the students. So you could just call and do that. Great. And the pictures always made it look way longer than it was. It was at least 500 feet. I don't remember the exact length right now, but it's a monster. Okay, good picture. This is the quiz question I ask every time too. This is World War II. All that beautiful deck work, they're just throwing away. This is 1942. What? Now you got to think outside the box. No, not a submarine, but what kind of boat, what kind of vessel do you think they made out of a passenger ship? And it's not what you think.
Didn't they make it an aircraft carrier?
Yes, they did. Boom. So they got the 4 funnels, they built the island around them, and they put a wooden deck on it with no arresting gear. So no tail hooks.
What?
Yeah, so they did that with one of the other passenger ships too. So they're the only like side wheel passenger ships to ever serve, and side wheel vessels to ever carriers to ever serve the US Navy. They were based at Navy Pier in Chicago and trained pilots for the war effort. It was a lot safer to recover people from southern Lake Michigan than it was from the ocean. So they trained about 18 or 19,000 pilots altogether, including President Bush, well, future President Bush Sr. That's been 2, that's right. And then after the war, within 4 years, it was gone. They scrapped them both. So there just wasn't the demand for the passenger ships after the war anymore because everybody was buying cars after coming back from the war. So the passenger ships there are some Great Lakes cruises left, but they are very expensive. You know, $2,000 to $3,000 a person, easy. Some even come from overseas. Like there's one that comes from Germany and then does the lakes and then they go back. Well, Americans don't get that much vacation. We can't do that. There are the 2 carriers. And then there's a number of aircraft wrecks still at the bottom of Lake Michigan. So several different people have been able to salvage them to use for restorations for, you know, to make them flyable again in some cases, usually museum pieces. But there were a few dozen that had to ditch because they missed the deck or they didn't slow down fast enough, or why they didn't put any arresting gear on it. I don't know. But plus it only being 500 feet long. So you got practice on carriers that were 300 feet shorter than the big fleet carriers in the Navy. So if you could do it here, I'm like, okay. Plus, you got to go back to Chicago every night. So I guess it's not the worst. And the Wilfred Sykes is the first new freighter that was built after World War II on the Great Lakes. Because like I mentioned, there was that big glut of tonnage. So this was a new standard for design with just fancier accommodations because crew accommodations were just awful before. I mean, you had like school bus leather bunk beds, that kind of stuff, really uncomfortable. And it was a huge deal. I mean, for launches like this back in the day, this is 1949, there'd be like 10,000 people would come to watch it. Because on the Great Lakes, they're all side launches too, because of space limitations. So this was built in Lorain, Ohio. So yeah, picture of a dock, it's still in service. You can go on marinetraffic.com and see where it is right now and where it's going. That's fun, because I know people on the boats. So I've had them like video call me from like the middle of Lake Erie, which is like, don't lie to me, I know you're in the lake right now. Yeah, that one, they made it look fancier. So pre-Photoshop right there, because that looks too good. And yeah, they would tour the lakes and people lined up like this just to see it, which is kind of amazing. Closest you can get to being on a ship like that is in Toledo at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. They have a freighter built in 1911 that you can tour and a tug built in 1903. So it gives you a feeling for how hot it was, especially. Yeah, go ahead.
What Photoshop did they do?
It was manual touching up. Like you had like actual artists had to physically go on like the negative and the print and like paint on it.
Oh, so it's just kind of like enhanced.
Same with like the colorized postcard. That was originally a black and white photo and someone went in and like hand inked it and then they made prints of it.
Wow.
That's why you see those old colorized postcards that look really wrong. You're like, they only have like 4 colors and you're like, no, this is not right. Like the sides of roads weren't pink. The clouds weren't yellow. That's a decent one, but it was really popular to send postcards of boats to people. So a lot of our postcards actually on the back have whatever they wrote to someone. Usually it's like, I'm here, see you later. It's the exact stuff we would send in a text now. They would use a postcard for it and make the post office do it. I suppose you still could. I know a few people who do it just for the anachronism of it. So, because it's the anticipation, because you don't know how long it's going to take to get the message. It's like when you order something on Amazon, they're like, it's going to be here in 7 days, but it comes in 2 and it's like the best thing that's ever happened to you. And of course, now there's 1,000 footers. There's 13 of them on the Great Lakes. 5 of them were built by American Shipbuilding Company. They're all still in service. They can hold, let's see. I know the biggest one can hold 78,000 tons, which is about 120 schooners worth. And they like to advertise it's 3,000 semi-trucks worth of cargo. So, but everything on the Great Lakes is bulk cargo. There's not container ships, things like that. Although we're getting a lot more foreign wind turbines coming in, especially in Monroe, because they're so big that transporting them over land is prohibitive. So there's a company in Quebec that's shipping them through the lakes to Monroe. So Monroe's a big port for that right now. Local interest. And then the other company we have most of the drawings for is Great Lakes Engineering Works. They closed in 1962, but American Shipbuilding Company bought up their plans morgue. So luckily they survived. Obviously, the Edmund Fitzgerald is the most famous vessel that they built. That's the only vessel that ever existed on the Great Lakes and the only one that ever sank. Just because of the, yeah, my parents were in college when the song came out. They're like, imagine a song being played on the radio, but it's also 7 minutes long because you couldn't skip it. So we have a nice presentation that was made to SNAME back in 1958 when it was built with all the machinery designs and stuff. So basically it has miniaturized versions of the plans, and then we have the original plans. I brought the midship section with me because that's the one I've had to reproduce the most for people, and I've had it scanned. So just because of not knowing, but I met someone who got to go, who's at the wreck in 1996 when they went back to it. So it was really fascinating to learn about that. So some people are hoping there'll be a 50th anniversary in 2025, but it's also just over the Canadian side of Lake Superior. There's no international waters in the Great Lakes. It's either American or Canadian. So lake shipping companies are always complaining about ocean going companies being able to go to international waters and do things. I don't know what those things are, and I don't want to know either. Something to add to this, they built one yacht. That's the Delphine. It was built in 1921 for the Dodges of Dodge car fame. And they only used it for a few years because Horace Dodge died, and so his wife used it. And then in World War II, it got sucked up by the US military. So imagine this white yacht. They put it in gray and camo. They put 3-inch guns on it, anti-aircraft guns, and a Marine contingent. And it was the Navy Chief of Staff's personal boat in Washington, D.C. And then they gave it back to the Dodges after the war, going, have fun, fix it, take the guns off. Well, they did that first. This one's fun because we do have plans for a few yachts built on the lakes in the 20s that still exist. This one still does. It was a Belgian guy bought it in the late 90s, and he put $60 million into it to return it to its original appearance. Took out diesel engines and put back the original steam engines because he preferred the way it felt on the deck. It felt like a heartbeat because it's only 80 RPMs versus the diesel were 3,000. It still uses, I think, 600 liters of fuel per hour, but you know, so you do you. You can rent it. It's 100,000 euros a day, or 500 euros for 1,000 euros for an entire week, for you and 11 guests and a crew of 20. So you have more crew than you. And for extra money, they'll also include a lounge pianist. I just found that out this morning before I came. I was down the luxury yacht rabbit hole and finding out. I've had it happen twice that someone contacted me for plans for this and for another yacht built by a company called Defoe that was in Bay City, Michigan, that built a lot of yachts they're yacht construction companies who are trying to return these to the original look with all the wood paneling inside, nicely oiled. I don't want to know how much nicely oiled mahogany costs in the 2020s now. It's probably even worse. But it's a surprisingly big yacht. It's 250 to 300 feet long, somewhere in that range. So it's a monster for that time period. I mean, not compared to like Jeff Bezos's yacht now, but it's people talking because now it's based in Monaco and people love to write articles about it because you have all these sleek modern yachts and then you just have this one like puffing white smoke off in the background. You can also rent it for weddings and for like parties. It'll host 120 people for parties, I guess, but they can't go anywhere. It's rules. So if anybody's in Marseille or Monaco and has like 100,000 extra euros sitting around, just hit me up. And something I wanted to add, this is something else, because historical records always seem pretty neutral to us. It's just, this is what happened. This is evidence of it. This is informing us of what things were like at the time. So for example, this is just a deck cross section from the city of Cleveland, which was a passenger ship built in 1887. I mean, you do get some historical information about the time, but I'm going to zoom in on that part. So segregated bathroom. That came up randomly when I was helping someone do research, and we didn't expect to find that. It depended by company, but the passenger boats in the lakes weren't desegregated till 1949. There was a secretary class when you went to secretary school in the 40s. It was all white except for one African-American student. And she went aboard and the crew wouldn't let her do it. It went to the Michigan Supreme Court, and the Michigan Supreme Court is like, why aren't you letting her on board, basically? And that got folded into Brown versus Board of Education later. So there's an interesting sort of lakes connection there, and it's one that kind of gets lost because most of the time I'm digging into really STEM related stuff. So all of a sudden something that pops up that's like super appropriate to society today, and I'm like, geez. So that's just something I wanted to point out about the records, because that just happened last week. We found that one. So I haven't seen it in any other boats, but it was often there, just not specifically listed. There'd be a separate, like their bathroom is next to like where the engineers would stay on a different deck than the main bathrooms would be. So you even had to go to a different place to do it. Please answer questions, or don't answer questions. Please ask me questions. Feel free. Anything, even if I don't know, I'm not afraid to tell you that I don't. And then I have goodies for you to look at. There's two books about shipbuilding from the 1850s, one from 1873, the Loudon Wilson decks, and then some different architectural drawings there. Anyone, don't be scared. It's okay if you don't.
What's the really old one from? You said that you brought that's in good.
Oh, this one, let's see. Plans of the steam yacht Vedette, constructed by Ward Stanton and Company, Newburgh, Delaware, 1878. And it's in surprisingly good shape for something from 1878, because people have donated stuff from the 2000s that looks like it's 100 years old. And that's 150 years old almost. And it's done all in ink too, which is different. Because some of them are pencil, like the one rolled up against the wall is all pencil. Hand drafted, of course, again. So yeah, that's the oldest, and then the newest one is the 1981.
2 days ago.
It's now the Paul Tregurtha, but it's one of the 1,000-foot vessels. And that one's interesting because it has plans that are on plastic too. Clear plastic and Mylar and paper. This is weird combination. They couldn't decide, I guess.
Nobody else has questions? No questions?
There were a ton last year.
I know, well.
That's okay.
answered them all maybe. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If you guys want to take a closer look at some of the things that Mark brought, that would be great.